Hi folks, welcome back. It is week 2 of our CIE 401 Globalization and Contextualization class. And this week we're talking about conceptualizing globalization. Well, quite frankly, the whole semester we're talking about conceptualizing globalization, but we're going to focus on some particular elements of it this week. You should know already that week 2 is an online-only week. There will be no live class held this week because I will be abroad speaking at a conference/workshop in Germany. But in lieu of our regular class, I'd like for you to do several things. One, you're already doing. I'd like for you to watch the screencast. And after you watch the screencast, I'd like for you to post some comments and engage in discussion on our class discussion board. I'll talk more about that later related to some of the questions I have for you. Second of all, I'd like for you to make sure that you're doing your week 2, if you haven't already done it, and week 3 readings. You have quite a bit that's in the syllabus that you can take a look at in terms of readings. We'll be looking both at the Lechner and Boley edited book as well as the Baker book. So you have some reading to do. And make sure that you are understanding what you're reading. Take your time. You've got plenty of it because we're not having a live class this week. Thirdly, I'd like for you to form and meet with your final project proposal team. One of the things that I'm asking you to do for this class, and as you know from our discussion of the syllabus, is to create an NGO development proposal. And what I'd like for you to do is I'd like for you to use our class time, our regularly scheduled class time. I'd like for you to meet in our classroom for that time because we have it reserved anyway. And I would like for you as an independent class, as people that can come together, I'd like for you to figure out who of you are going to be working together on the final project NGO development proposal. So plan your team, get your team together. Think about what your strategy is for attacking the final project. How will you meet? What are your ideas? How will you develop them? All right? I'd like for you to take some time to identify the individual strengths and weaknesses of each of the people in your proposed team. So for example, some of you might be really good at scheduling things and figuring out timelines. Some of you might be really good at writing. Some of you might be really good at research. Some of you might be really good at critiquing. Right? So you need to identify who's going to be in your proposal team, come together around a shared interest. You need to identify what your strategy is going to be for the semester going forward so that the final project isn't a big surprise at the end of the semester. And I'd like for you to work together to identify who would be doing what. What are the roles that you guys would fit best in? All right? So take plenty of time to do that. Like I've said already, use our regularly scheduled classroom to do that. It's a larger room than we need anyway, so you will have plenty of space to split apart into groups. It certainly serves as a place where you can come together and talk about what you're doing. And then fourthly, when you have your team together, I'd like for you to prepare your topics with your team for the NGO development proposals. You do have due on week 3, the next class, you do have due your topics. I want to hear what your topics are for your NGO development proposals, and I want to know who your teams are. So this is all part of what you're doing, and I want you to work with your team to prepare for that. And you can see the instructions and resources in the syllabus if you have any questions. All right, so there's plenty of stuff to do. Some of it is individual, watching the screencast, engaging in the discussion board, doing the readings and taking notes. And some of it is team-oriented, forming a meeting with your proposal team and preparing topics with your team for the NGO development proposals in time to talk about it with me again next week in week 3. All right, so lots to do. Next, let's see, I've cut some of this off. Let me see if I can move it up. There we go. So let's ask a question. Is education the most globalized among public institutions? Okay, so a couple of things come to mind here. I obviously have a quote from Jürgen Schriever that I'd like to talk about, but I'd also like to deconstruct that sentence a little bit. So what is a public institution, or what is an institution? I mean, we often think of institutions as buildings or organizations, and they are, absolutely. We can also talk about institutions as legitimized processes or shared expectations, a much broader meaning, right? So in this question, we're talking about public institutions in terms of organizations that have a broader meaning, right? So we're kind of mixing some of those. Now, we say public institutions, public versus private. So private institutions are usually restricted in terms of membership. They are usually, they're not usually, but they are often for commercial purposes where they have an overt economic focus. They are often privately held. In other words, there are particular owners of the institutions, right? Whereas a public institution is generally open to the public, right? Open to everyone. It's generally not owned by a particular individual, but instead might be governed by a state or another publicly held organization like that or institution like that. It tends to not have as its primary function an economic or a commercial purpose, although that might be a secondary function or an implicit function. All right, so we're talking about public institutions, and public institutions are generally identified as a government, right? Healthcare, and education. Now there are others, but those are the big three that come up all the time. So among government, healthcare, and education, obviously, we're asking, is education the most globalized among those? So is education in some way more globalized than government, healthcare, and a host of other public institutions? Well, what Schriever said, now 14 years ago, he said a survey of different fields of comparative policy, and I'm looking right here, right? A survey of different fields of comparative policy research shows indeed that in no other area of public policy, neither in economic nor in social or environmental policy, does there exist such a high degree of global standardization of organizational structures, policy-relevant models, and reform discourse as in educational policy and policy-oriented educational research. Whew. All right. So a couple things to be aware of. He's talking specifically about comparative policy research, and he's talking about a high degree of global standardization among these things: organizational structures, policy-relevant models, and reform discourse. Okay, so first of all, he's focusing on policy. So if we look at policy, Jürgen Schriever, who is a professor emeritus of Humboldt University in Berlin, very well-known and established figure in the field of comparative education research and theory, does a lot of theory stuff. All right. He says when we're looking at policy and comparative policy research, in education, there is an exceptionally high degree of global standardization. And so Schriever, for our purposes or our discussion here, is equating global standardization with globalization. Okay? Global standardization and globalization. Now, we can debate that, whether or not that is an adequate way of identifying what is globalized and what isn't. And standardization is certainly one of the arguments that is made to suggest that education or other institutions are becoming more globalized, right? But we need to be aware that that is up for debate in itself. And when we talk about global standardization, he's talking about organizational structure, he's talking about policy models, and he's talking about reform discourse. So structures, models, and discourse. So what is an organizational structure of educational policy or educational research? What is a policy-relevant model for educational policy and educational research? And what is reform discourse for educational policy and educational research? I know I've been a little redundant in stating each of those questions, but it is important for us to consider how we're thinking about this global standardization and what structure, model, and discourse mean if we're talking about globalization related to education. And also emphasizing that one of the limitations of Schriever's statement is policy. All right, so that should get your thinking caps on and maybe is raising some questions that you have about education and globalization and how they fit together. So in answer to the question, is education the most globalized among public institutions? Schriever would say yes, if we're talking about educational policy and policy-oriented educational research. So in terms of education policy and research, then yes. But I don't think he has gone so far as to say that education as it is enacted in schools is the most globalized of institutions. That's an interesting distinction because there's a difference between policy and practice. The policy and research realm, he says yes. The practice realm, he says nothing. So let's think a little bit about how does globalization impact education? And I have several different items that I want to walk through. One is that we can discuss whether or not there is a uniform worldwide educational expansion. Now, if we had read the Schriever piece that the quote came from on the previous page, or the Schriever piece that I referenced in an earlier presentation with you guys, then you would see how he discusses this. But what we have is we have the Baker Schooled Society book, right? That helps us think about uniform worldwide educational expansion. So, and again, we need to deconstruct this a little bit. So let's start at the end, expansion. Right? So education in its formal sense, the school sense, has spread very widely around the world. It would be difficult to find a nation state, a government system, that did not have an education system that was part of it. Right? That anywhere in the world, right now in the 21st century. That's interesting. It wasn't that way just 100 years ago. And it definitely wasn't that way 200 years ago. And in the scheme of history, this is a relatively recent phenomenon. I know I'm talking about centuries at a time, but we're talking about the scheme of long history, that this expansion of education worldwide is a relatively recent phenomenon. And if we look at the historical evidence, really the expansion of education worldwide didn't happen to the degree that we are most familiar with or comfortable with until the mid-20th century, until the 1950s, 1960s. Right? So really very recent in terms of uniform or in terms of global educational expansion. All right, we've already talked about the worldwide part. What's this uniform part here? What do we mean by uniform worldwide educational expansion? Well, this is a word that I took directly from Schriever. Actually, this is something I borrowed from him. And the argument that he makes is that as education has expanded worldwide, it's taken with it certain models. And those models, for better or for worse, are relatively uniform. And the way that he's thinking about uniformity is in terms of structure, model, and discourse. So if we look at the structure, the models, and the discourse of education worldwide, we see a relatively uniform expansion. Now this is a little different from our distinction between policy and practice that we were just talking about on the last slide. So Schriever does take the step a little bit forward to say that it's not just policy and research that has been globally standardized, but that the educational structure, model, and why am I blanking on the last one? Discourse, structure, model, and discourse is relatively uniform as it has expanded worldwide. All right, we're going to pause here because we have several more to go on how does globalization impact education. And then we'll take off in our next screencast with this idea of the institutionalized model of schooling and how that is a product of or a connection to globalization and education.